Hello, welcome back to Systematic's Symphony of Species. In this video, we are going to review another species concept called as Retrospective Reproductive Community Concept, RRCC. The paper discusses the ongoing debate among biologists and philosophers regarding the definition of a species, and proposes the concept of a retrospective reproductive community, RRCC, as a more suitable framework. The authors argue that operationalist concepts, which focus on observable outcomes, are not viable for defining species. Instead, they suggest that species of sexual organisms should embody cohesive and integrating processes such as interbreeding and shared ecological pressures. The biological species concept, BSC, which emphasizes contemporary reproductive compatibility in intrinsic factors, is considered inadequate due to its limitations.
The RRCC, formalized mathematically in multi-species coalescent models, views species as reproductive communities of the past. This approach justifies the traditional practice of taxonomists using morphological data to infer past reproductive cohesion. The authors acknowledge the challenge of determining which reproductive communities deserve to be ranked as species, demes, or populations, emphasizing the absence of a universal or widely applicable species rank. They argue that the presence or absence of sex is just one example of the variability biologists face, and a useful species concept cannot specify detailed cohesive mechanisms. A retrospective perspective, in the context of the abstract, refers to looking back in time to understand and define species. Instead of focusing solely on contemporary factors and characteristics, such as current reproductive compatibility, a retrospective perspective considers the historical context and evolutionary processes that have shaped living organisms. It involves examining the reproductive communities of the past and recognizing that the traits and genes of organisms alive today were influenced by isolating factors and cohesive processes that occurred in previous generations. In the context of the proposed retrospective reproductive community concept, RRCC, a retrospective perspective suggests viewing species as entities that emerged from historical reproductive communities. This perspective acknowledges that the organisms we observe today were shaped by both intrinsic, genetic, and extrinsic, e.g., geographic, factors in the past. It emphasizes understanding the evolutionary history and processes that led to the distinct identities of species, rather than focusing solely on their current characteristics.
Biologists have historically observed that organisms group together based on similarities into distinct clusters. These clusters represent the discrete structuring of biodiversity, where organisms in a particular area exhibit differences in numerous traits. Taxonomists identify and describe these trait-sharing clusters, forming the basis for explanations of biodiversity by evolutionary biologists and others. If a consensus had been reached among biologists to define a species as a trait-sharing cluster of organisms, discussions about distinct species would revolve around similarities and differences. This would leave the task of explaining why or how these species came to exist to evolutionary biology and ecology. However, historical species concepts in biology extended beyond traits to include mating and descent. In the 20th century, evolutionary biologists sought to integrate the understanding of evolutionary processes into the concept of species, defining species in terms of interbreeding and reproductive isolation. This conceptualization viewed species as communities of organisms exchanging genes through sexual reproduction. On the other hand, phylogeneticists, focused on reconstructing genetic descent history, proposed alternative species concepts that considered only genealogical history, independent of the cohesive processes shaping that history. In these genealogical concepts, species are recognized as the smallest monophyletic units. While these three species concepts, trait-based clusters, reproductive communities, and genealogical units, may often coincide in delimiting the same set of organisms, there are cases where they diverge. Different researchers using distinct species concepts may delineate different sets of organisms as species, leading to variations in the meaning and truth of claims about species and their practical implications.
Biologists' preferences for species concepts are not solely determined by their disciplinary interests, such as evolutionary process, phylogeny, taxonomy, ecology, physiology, as they also vary in their inclination towards operationalism. Operationalism refers to whether recognized units should minimize commitment to theories of cause and instead directly reflect observable outcomes. The reproductive community, genealogical lineage, and trait-sharing cluster form a causal sequence and also a sequence from hypothesis to predicted observations, transitioning from theoretical commitment to operationalism. Some biologists choose to conceive of species operationally as trait-sharing clusters, regardless of their interests in speciation, phylogeny, or predictive classifications. Authors defining species in terms of observable trait differences have been criticized for potentially confusing evidence with the concept itself. However, some of these authors intentionally present their concepts with operationalist intent. The crucial question is not whether operationalist species concepts qualify as species concepts, but rather how suitable they are in capturing the complexities of biological diversity and evolutionary processes.
The question, what is a species, remains a topic of debate among biologists and philosophers, and while answers may enlighten, they do not necessarily settle the debate on species concepts. The evolutionary species concept, Sensu Lato, de Queiroz, 1998, 2007, Maiden, 1997, Simpson, 1951, 1961, Wiley, 1978, has gained widespread acceptance. De Queiroz's 2007 definition characterizes species as separately evolving metapopulation lineages, encapsulating isolation, process, integration, and history. While this concept provides a general portrait of species over time, it doesn't resolve the practical challenge faced by biologists addressing the question, how should we conceive of species at this moment? Many biologists empirically addressing species are more concerned with the immediate question of species delimitation, seeking guidance on choosing among the conflicting delimitations proposed by interbreeding, genealogy, and traits. The assurance that these delimitations may eventually coincide over evolutionary time does not assist the biologist in the present moment. The authors argue that varying delimitations do not merely represent mistakes of different methods seeking the same answer. Instead, they signify different concepts of living species and their boundaries. How does the focus on cohesive processes through time make the retrospective reproductive community concept more suitable for biology than the instantaneous focus of the BSc and BSc+? The focus on cohesive processes through time makes the retrospective reproductive community concept more suitable for biology than the instantaneous focus of the BSc and BSc+ for several reasons. The retrospective reproductive community concept, RRCC, emphasizes the importance of understanding the historical processes that have shaped the traits and genes of living organisms. It recognizes that the organisms alive today were shaped by isolating factors of the past, not those of the present, and that cohesive and integrating processes such as interbreeding and shared ecological pressures are essential for understanding and explaining traits across the genome and among organisms. In contrast, the biological species concept, BSc, and its extension, the biological species concept plus, BSc+, focus on the contemporary and prospective reproductive compatibility, which may predict future matings but does not fully explain the traits and genes that living organisms already possess. The BSc and BSc+ rely on causes of the present, rather than causes of the past, and their restriction to the present moment limits their utility in understanding the historical processes that have shaped the traits and genes of living organisms. The retrospective view of the RRCC aligns with the concept of species as evolutionary actors and containers for taxonomic data synthesis, incorporating cohesive processes and historical context in understanding the organisms alive today. By focusing on cohesive processes through time, the RRCC provides a more comprehensive and historical perspective on species, considering both intrinsic and extrinsic factors that have influenced reproductive isolation and trait evolution in the past. This retrospective view allows for a more accurate and informative understanding of evolutionary units and their roles in explaining traits and genetic history, making it more suitable for broad use in biology. In summary, the focus on cohesive processes through time in the RRCC allows for a more comprehensive understanding of the historical factors that have shaped living organisms, providing a more suitable and informative species concept for broad use in biology compared to the instantaneous focus of the BSc and BSc+. What are the cohesive processes that shape reproductive communities in sexual organisms? The cohesive processes that shape reproductive communities in sexual organisms encompass a range of factors that contribute to the integrity and identity of these communities. These processes include intrinsic and extrinsic factors that influence reproductive interactions, ecological adaptations, and genetic and phenotypic cohesion. In sexual organisms, cohesive processes such as interbreeding, shared ecological pressures, and genetic and phenotypic interactions play a crucial role in maintaining the coherence of genealogy and traits within a reproductive community. Additionally, ecological and developmental interactions, habitat preferences, and selective regimes contribute to reproductive isolation and adaptive commitment, further shaping the identity and integrity of reproductive communities. Furthermore, varied processes such as allopatric isolation, ecological selection, and reproductive systems contribute differently to cohesion in different groups of organisms, leading to diverse mechanisms that contribute to the formation and maintenance of reproductive communities. These cohesive processes are essential for understanding the evolutionary units and explaining the traits and genetic history of living organisms, particularly in the context of speciation biology and population genetics. The concept of retrospective reproductive communities, as proposed in the document, differs from the classic biological species concept, BSC, in several key ways. Temporal focus. The BSC is focused on the present, defining a species as a set of living organisms that currently share interbreeding compatibility. In contrast, the retrospective view looks backward in time to consider the reproductive communities of the past that have given rise to the present species. Inclusion of extrinsic factors. The BSC+, an extension of the BSC, incorporates extrinsic factors such as geography into the species concept. However, the RRCC goes further by considering both intrinsic and extrinsic factors that influenced reproductive isolation in the past, not just in the present. Historical perspective. The RRCC emphasizes the importance of historical processes and events in shaping the traits and genes of living organisms. It suggests that the current species are the result of past reproductive communities and the evolutionary forces that acted upon them. Cohesive processes. The RRCC focuses on the cohesive processes that bound reproductive communities in the past, such as interbreeding and shared ecological pressures. These processes are seen as essential in maintaining coherence in genealogy and traits, which is not as emphasized in the BSC, which is more concerned with current reproductive compatibility. Evolutionary actors. The RRCC views species as evolutionary actors, influenced by the past, and uses this perspective to explain the current traits of organisms. The BSC, on the other hand, is more predictive, focusing on the potential for interbreeding in the present and future. Taxonomic utility. The RRCC is designed to be more useful for taxonomic purposes, as it aligns with the traditional practice of using morphological data to infer past reproductive cohesion. The BSC, while useful for some purposes, does not fully align with the taxonomic species used for broader biological explanations. What are the drawbacks of the biological species concept plus, BSC plus, in delimiting species? The biological species concept plus has several drawbacks in delimiting species, as outlined in the paper. One of the primary drawbacks is its focus on the present and future, rather than the past. The BSC plus defines an extant species as a set of living organisms whose intrinsic reproductive compatibilities and extrinsic context, for example geography, together allow them to interbreed while isolating them from other such groups. However, this focus on the present and future reproductive compatibility limits its utility in understanding the historical processes that have shaped the traits and genes of living organisms. Additionally, the BSC plus is criticized for its restriction to intrinsic factors and its exclusion of extrinsic factors from species identity and delimitation. This limitation means that the BSC plus does not fully account for the historical context and cohesive processes that have influenced reproductive isolation in the past, which is essential for a comprehensive understanding of evolutionary units and their traits. Furthermore, the BSC plus is seen as overly inclusive, as it would require biologists to accept all full barriers as species-worthy, even if purely extrinsic and however numerous. This could lead to the hypersplitting of species, considering separate populations as distinct species based on purely extrinsic factors, such as geographic isolation, even if their genetic and ecological differentiation is minimal. In summary, the drawbacks of the biological species concept plus, BSC plus, in delimiting species include its focus on the present and future, its restriction to intrinsic factors, and its potential for hypersplitting species based on purely extrinsic barriers, which may not align with a comprehensive understanding of evolutionary units and their historical context. The present paper, The Species as a Reproductive Community Emerging from the Past, delves into the ongoing debate in biology regarding the definition of a species and advocates for a retrospective view of species as reproductive communities. It critiques the biological species concept and proposes the biological species concept plus as an extension, incorporating extrinsic factors in defining species. However, it highlights the limitations of both concepts in focusing solely on the present and future, rather than the past. The retrospective reproductive community concept, RRCC, is proposed as the preferred approach, emphasizing the need to view species retrospectively as reproductive communities of the recent past, taking into account cohesive processes that have shaped genealogy and traits. The RRCC is suggested to be more suitable for encompassing the complexities of evolutionary units and explaining the traits and genes of living organisms. The paper scrutinizes the limitations of the present-focused biological species concept and its extension, the biological species concept plus, in defining species solely based on the present and future reproductive compatibility, neglecting historical factors. It advocates for the retrospective reproductive community concept, RRCC, as the preferred approach, emphasizing the need to view species retrospectively as reproductive communities of the recent past. The RRCC aligns with the concept of species as evolutionary actors and containers for taxonomic data synthesis, incorporating cohesive processes and historical context in understanding the organisms alive today. The document highlights the importance of incorporating extrinsic factors and the historical perspective to achieve comprehensive prediction and explanation of genealogy and traits, distinguishing the RRCC as a more suitable species concept for broad use in biology. In conclusion, the paper presents a critical analysis of species concepts, advocating for the retrospective reproductive community concept, RRCC, over the biological species concept and biological species concept plus, due to its emphasis on historical context and cohesive processes. It emphasizes the need to view species retrospectively as reproductive communities of the recent past, incorporating extrinsic factors and historical parameters to provide a comprehensive understanding of evolutionary units and their traits. The RRCC is proposed as a more suitable and informative species concept for broad use in biology, addressing the complexities of evolutionary units and their roles in explaining traits and genetic history. The paper also concludes by suggesting that taxonomy should be seen as an approximation, allowing biology to focus on understanding the various interacting processes that shaped reproductive communities throughout evolutionary history. The authors advocate for a retrospective perspective, relinquishing the pursuit of a natural meaning for species rank and acknowledging taxonomy as an approximation to better comprehend the complexities of the natural world. Thank you for watching, and please share your views on the retrospective reproductive community concept in the comments.